Today's conveyancing clients expect speed, clarity, and frequent updates. But tight margins and rising client expectations put pressure on conveyancing practices. With smart automation and clear workflows, Leap helps conveyancing teams spend less time on admin and more time supporting their clients. Learn more at leap.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today we have Simon Slater, CEO of E4 Strategic. It's actually a South African business that's over in the UK now. Might not appreciate the comparison, but for the benefit of listeners, the best comparison is perhaps something akin to a PEXA, in that what E4 did in South Africa was really create a much more joined up approach to a property transaction, and looking at presumably bringing that over to the UK now, Simon.
Yeah, hi David. Yeah, thanks very much for having me on the show. I'll maybe just give you very briefly a little bit of my own background, and then I'll just dive into what you just asked around the South African business, and then just give you a bit of a sense of the UK. Yeah. Tell
us a little bit about yourself and what you do, Simon. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So my long time ago, but my background was as a corporate M&A solicitor, both in South Africa and in the UK. And then prior to coming over to the UK in 2021, I spent about 18 years with the E4 business in South Africa. A large chunk of that was as group COO. I was the acting COO for a number of years. And then, since moving to the UK, I've essentially headed up the UK business.
You may not appreciate the comparison, but if PEXA has kind of done what it has done in Australia in terms of digitizing the property transaction, E4 was pretty instrumental in taking what was presumably quite a manual paper process in South Africa into what we might describe as a sort of digitalized experience.
I think the comparisons are good in one sense that, PEXA has done incredibly well in the Australian market. They really are, I guess, the kind of dominant tech player. And I think similarly, South Africa, in the South African market, E4, along with one or two others, is, probably the leading prop tech player in the market by some way. I mean, we work with all of the big six South African mortgage lenders. They do kind of more than 95% out of the market, and we pretty much work with every single law firm in the country that does conveyancing. We put a platform in place, which in very simple terms, from a workflow management perspective, links the lenders and the conveyancers.
Critically, that's quite different from other models that are out there that have been based on completion, for example. Why was that important to you, and why didn't you particularly go down that route, for example?
I mean, it started a long time ago in the kind of early days with PKI and digital certificates and all the rest of it. But I think we saw the opportunity being 20, 25 years ago, really just fundamentally linking the lender's back-end systems through to what you call in this country the case management software used by conveyancers. And that it was a horrible process. It was completely manual. It was all paper driven. You'd send something to the other party, and there'd be no visibility at all around kind of the status of the transaction. So we just did the obvious, which was put a platform in the middle and kind of join the key players together. And then over the last 10, 15 years, it's evolved into adding value add solutions both on lender side and on conveyancer side, and just enhancing the core platform itself, adding more and more layers of solutions, to the point where today, we link up lender, all three, they call them attorneys in South Africa. So bond attorney, transfer attorney, cancellation attorney. We link to every major municipality in the country or local council. We link to the tax revenue authority, and obviously we link through to the deeds office, or what you call the land registry in this country.
You've taken the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say, is there sort of a centralized land registry in South Africa as well then?
Yeah, there is. Very, very similar to here. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess I just add a bit of color. In some senses, the remaining Achilles heel in the South African market is that very last portion of the process, in terms of the deeds office itself, where there's still some kind of manual processing. but pretty much everything up into the front door of the deeds office, these days is incredibly digital.
I mean, that is a really interesting comparison with the UK market, where, I mean, arguably we're in not too dissimilar a position where there's a lot of digitization that's happened at the front end, but we're still really waiting on Land Registry to improve its systems so that we can integrate that whole process front to back.
Yeah, that's true. Although I do think, people may not appreciate it, but I think the Land Registry in the UK has made huge strides already in terms of, what can be done digitally. And I mean, I heard it the other day at that Santander conference. It's a massive project to kind of digitalize all of those old records, as we all know. So it's kind of an ongoing thing. And I think they're about 50% of the way through that project. But yeah, I mean, they've certainly got a really good roadmap, if I can put it like that.
So you've already made some comparisons between the South African and England and Wales conveyancing markets. How does the South African market work? And already there sound to be a few differences. And how does that translate to the work that you're doing, for example, in spotting an opportunity to come over to the UK?
Just first of all, the South African legal conveyancing process is very similar. So with a couple of differences, it's English law based, with a Roman Dutch element. The conveyancing process is very similar. The role players are exactly the same, with one or two real big differences. Things like, the offer is binding right at the front of the process, a bit like Scotland. And then, a few small things. Lenders actually only pay out the mortgage funds, once they have absolute certainty that their mortgage security is actually registered. Whereas that, as you know, that doesn't happen in this country. Yeah, the process in South Africa is very data driven. We actually own a business called Searchworks out of Cape Town. We've owned it for many, many years, and we bought it originally with the intention of, I guess, infusing all of the relevant data needed in that whole property process into the actual workflow solutions themselves. And it's been, tremendously successful. So kind of one set of data, everyone sees the same data. Maybe a little bit easier in the South African market, just in the sense that there isn't as much history and complexity around, old titles, etc. But yeah, it's incredibly digital.
Is that akin to the debate that we're having in the UK around what we call upfront and material information?
Yeah, it's less of an issue in the South African market, but certainly here, as we both know, and my personal view on that is the concept itself of having an upfront, pack of data makes complete sense if you kind of, step away from the noise and the history of it all. But for a seller to have upfront data, and then for that data to kind of move seamlessly downstream through the mortgage application process, through the valuation journey, and through the conveyancing journey is almost a no-brainer. We see it a lot more advanced than that in the conveyancing space. Where we really want to get to is, depending on that kind of data set that's upfront with that case, that data set should tell us how complex a transaction is likely to be in the conveyancing journey or not. So, for example, if it's a relatively straightforward property, a straightforward transaction, the conveyancing journey should be straightforward and simple and quick. Whereas if we know from previous transactions on that same property that it's the opposite, it's complex, etc., then we can expect the conveyancing journey to be longer, potentially, cost a bit more, and the conveyancer needing to spend more time resolving whatever the particular issues on that property are.
Does that, Simon, reflect in the conveyancer's ability to price accordingly then? Are they able up front to be able to say, we know this is going to be a slightly more complicated transaction, therefore we know we're going to be able to charge a bit more for it?
I mean, there may be exceptions, but my general understanding is no. Right now they have no view, unless they did the transaction themselves and they can go and dig out their old file. They have no view on what happened on that property transaction last time. And as a result, they'll do their searches, they'll raise their queries with, the seller conveyancer or with the lender, and they'll kind of go through all of those same issues all over again. And it's one of the big problems, isn't it? That, due to time and cost pressures, nobody really has the real ability to often unpack the root cause of some of these issues on a particular property and actually solve them. Many times we kind of paper over the problem with an insurance policy, an indemnity insurance policy or something like that. Whereas in reality, we should actually be trying to solve, whatever that particular issue is.
Probably 1,000 questions or more questions I could ask
Yeah.
about South Africa and the differences and similarities between the two markets. And I don't want to labour the point, but the point I'm trying to make, I suppose, is that the UK holds Australia or Scotland or Norway up as as an example. And in fact, talking to people that are in the know and on the ground, all of these systems have got similar sorts of flaws and faults, and there doesn't seem to be anything that's kind of out there that's perfect. But you obviously spotted an opportunity to enter the UK in 2021. What was the opportunity then? Does it, and presumably it still exists as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we arrived in 2021, the opportunity was very clear. Essentially we just looked at the market and we said, from what we can tell, all lender conveyance interactions, of which there's probably 6 or 7 core interactions in that 3 to 4 month journey, are just so ripe for transformation. The key things we saw was just a very much a siloed market. Everybody has tech, everybody has systems, but these systems really just don't talk to each other from a case management perspective, and therefore a lot of manual processes, even some paper still in the process. All key interactions are still in emails, often with long, cumbersome PDF attachments. It's just a nightmare. You really can't get an automated, streamlined process going in that environment. The situation we saw, I guess, was the obvious, which is just to try and solve lender conveyance interactions first off, is just put a platform in the middle that links them together and allows them to communicate. And if you just get that right, you can start to track the status of the transaction. You make the whole thing visible, and we can all see exactly what's going on. And then you can start to bring in kind of all the clever digital elements, digitalize all the paper, make sure everything is electronically signed, make sure we've got kind of the ability to report on and measure all the key metrics in that journey from a performance and a kind of quality perspective. So there's a huge amount that we saw could be done relatively quickly if there's the will from kind of key stakeholders that can actually make a difference.
And are you proposing that this is a technology that integrates with existing systems? Because the challenge again that we kind of see in the UK is there's a lot of historical systems that people use. You've talked about case management as a great example. And often the real blocker is that this is another system that people have to separately log into, or blah blah blah. How does this kind of fit in with that ecosystem?
No, it's a key point, and it's probably the number one thing that everybody asks on both sides of the fence, lender or conveyancer. So absolutely. So we know from real experience over the last 10, 15 years that if you're going to drop a platform in the middle to try and connect two parties, and they're already using software, the last thing they want is to kind of have to retype or rekey data in multiple systems. We're very much about building a kind of open platform, open APIs, and linking through, particularly for the medium to bigger law firms that have got, they either use one of the big CMS, providers already, or some of them, the really big ones, actually have built their own over many years. So absolutely, we got an open platform that links to all of those. And then on the lender side, as you can imagine, it's got to integrate with kind of multiple lender systems, and in the case of the big tier 1 mortgage lenders.
You referenced the fact that perhaps larger organizations have got the ability to invest in technology and that kind of thing. The criticism here of the technology providers is they don't always cater for the smaller firm, the firm that isn't particularly tech enabled. And of course we know that transactions only ever move as quick as the slowest part of the chain. Is this a solution that's going to enable that economies of scale, if you like, and enable firms that are much smaller to tap into that, as an example?
Any law firm can log into the platform itself and can use our front ends to do anything that they need to do. And I guess for the bigger firms with kind of their CMSs, it's kind of a backup or redundancy option. But absolutely, the smaller firms can come in and can raise what's called PVQs, post offer queries with a lender, for example, and can get the replies back through the platform. So there's lots of different options.
So if that was the opportunity back in 2021, is it the same opportunity now? I mean, the market has gone through a huge amount of change over that period. I mean, has your proposition changed in any way, for example, or do you sort of feel actually that you're better placed now that there's greater digitization than there was in 2021?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think the opportunity, if anything, has probably grown. One of the biggest positives, which you kind of touched on there, is that there's definitely a lot more momentum and kind of support in the market for trying to make big change. Been driven by the likes of the OPDA, and we've had that government consultation paper come out in the last couple of weeks. So there's pressure coming from all sides at the moment, which can only be positive. What's changed over the last 4 years since we've been in the UK is I think the process has got even worse in the sense that it takes longer. I think the kind of current stat is more than 4 months on a typical transaction. So it still remains a pretty horrible experience from a consumer perspective. But more positively, as I said, I think there is an appetite for kind of real transformation now. That Santander paper that was published a couple of weeks ago, kind of referenced the high costs of failed transactions in this country. And I think the number was incredible, staggering 1.5 billion or something. That accords with what we've seen in our dealings with the lenders, where they often talk about conversion rates and the kind of drop off that they see from offer through to completion. So, from their kind of narrow perspective, any platform that's going to help improve conversion rates, bring more certainty to the process, it will make a huge difference. If you kind of run the financial impact of that, it gets into the millions per year, really quickly.
And presumably there's an administrative cost to lenders constantly forking this money out and then having to have it returned if the transaction doesn't go through.
Yeah, 100%. So there's kind of all the lead up costs. So all the teams doing all the processing, getting it to kind of the point of payout, dealing with queries, dealing with the certificate of title, all the rest of it. And then, if it falls over, I guess it often falls over before they've paid out, but there will be transactions that kind of fall over right at the last stage.
I think we've kind of talked around the market. We've talked around obviously some of the differences between South Africa and England and Wales. What do you kind of see as the key issues between lenders and legal representation now, and how do you see that might change in the future?
I mean, it's a big question, and there's lots of kind of
we've only
challenges.
Got a bit of time for the podcast.
No, we have. So I mean, there's challenges around the obvious things like chains, etc., that kind of drive everybody crazy. But just in looking at it in our space, I think the lack of an integrated digital workflow is what we see as kind of the core problem. Lenders have the challenge of, first of all, having to manage thousands of law firms on their open panels. And then from a transaction perspective, they get literally thousands of post-valuation or PVQ queries from law firms around the country every month. And it's a huge frustration for the conveyancers too, to try and kind of get the responses out of the lenders that they need. And then there's just, very little real-time communication between the parties. And it's virtually impossible for everybody to track the true status of every transaction. And then I mentioned it earlier, there's almost no performance or quality metrics in this process at all. Nobody can really track, exactly what's going on and how, different players are performing in that current 3 to 4 month, conveyancing journey.
I read up recently that Lloyds Banking Group will no longer be accepting fax communications from the 16th of January 2026. I mean, it is still, to me, completely bonkers that banks continue to accept faxes as acceptable forms of communication. Of course, conveyancing, although it's much less heavily reliant on it than it used to be, it still operates that way. Is this a problem that E4 and its software seeks to solve as well?
Yeah, David, 100%. So that's probably one of the most extreme examples of how kind of manual and slow and non-digital the process is still, on certain transactions, etc. So put a platform in the middle, make all the communication electronic, make it in real time, make it visible, let everybody see the status of the case. I don't hear, faxes that often. I think that's probably a bit of a legacy thing. I mean, most of Lloyds's interactions will be far more digital than that in terms of emails, like all the big lenders. But I think, emails in themselves is a huge problem. For any of the big tier one lenders, to try and build workflow processes on the back of receiving hundreds and thousands of emails is virtually impossible, no matter how hard they kind of streamline it. So just put a platform in the middle and make it all electronic is got to be the way to go.
You mentioned emails. I mean, emails themselves, of course, are very insecure. Platforms like yours have got to deliver a level of security both for the conveyancers and for lenders, presumably, Simon.
As you'd expect, in terms of their kind of their supplier standards, all of the major lenders in this country have very stringent and onerous requirements around things like GDPR, privacy, information security, etc. So anything we build or have built has to, clearly meet all of those requirements. I mean, I think the good news for us is we're very used to that. We've operated in the South African market. The South African big lenders have exactly the same requirements. In fact, a number of the lenders, have actually been owned by international, banks over the years. So we're very au fait and kind of comfortable with what those requirements are, and the investment, both time, people, and money that you've got to put into making sure that these types of platforms and solutions are as secure as they can possibly be.
We're fast moving towards the end of the time we have for the podcast, and I've got a couple of other things that I'd like to ask Simon. Whenever I do these podcasts, I try and think about what the conveyancers' questions are going to be, and I think one of the conveyancer questions to another technology solution is where do you kind of see yourself being positioned in terms of, are you a collaborator in this increased digitization and this digitization journey that the market's going through? Are you a challenger? We've got products, we've talked about PEXA as a product. We've got things like the National Property Transaction Network that is being developed. Where do you kind of position yourself in terms of the proposition that you've got?
Yeah, David, it's an interesting question. So I think the answer is both. I think we absolutely want to be a challenger, in the sense that we believe that there is an opportunity to really transform how that conveyancing portion of the process currently works, and really we need to solve panel management, but the real one to solve is transaction management. How can we make that journey from offer through to completion, so much smoother and transparent? Having said that, it's all good and well being a challenger, but there's no ways you can tackle something as big as this on your own. And we know from experience that we have to collaborate closely with any partners that will add value to the portion of the process that we're trying to fix. And we already work with a number of value add players, and there's a lot more that we plan to work with. And then you touched on it earlier, we've got to plug into the existing infrastructure, and we've got to have fundamentally an open API-based platform that can link to all the different other systems that are already in the market. So yeah, challenger in one sense, but have to collaborate in another sense.
But this is one of the challenges that has always existed with something like this, which is to really benefit fully from this sort of technology. The critique is that everybody has to be using the same platform. I mean, the Law Society's rather ill-fated efforts to create VEO is a very prime example of that. The only way that was ever going to work was if everybody was on the same platform. I mean, have we got the same issue here, Simon?
Another good question. We kind of see it differently, though. We just think it's too big of a challenge to think of it like that. If you try and get every major lender and law society and SRA and conveyancers on board, you'll be here literally forever. So we've kind of taken a different approach. We've quietly for the last 3 to 4 years been building our Versa platform, and we've got it to a point where the time now is to be heavily engaging, particularly with the lenders, which we've done. But having said that, you have to bring the conveyancers with you on this journey. You've got to build something with them, which we're also working really hard to do. But the point I wanted to make was we have to, we see it as actually, going almost lender by lender or lender panel by lender panel. And that's kind of the only way. If you can get it in with, a couple of the really big lenders and their panels, which are common across most law firms. Law firms sit on, pretty much all of the the lender panels and you can show the true value, then the thing will kind of grow itself. We're pretty realistic about what's achievable. We're not looking to kind of own and dominate the space at all. We're here to make a real difference with a select number of lenders initially and all of their conveyancers. And then we're looking to try and kind of integrate into the bigger ecosystem as best we can to make the process easier for everybody.
So if that's been your journey for the past 4 years, Simon, what does the next 4, 5, 10, 15 years look like for E4 Strategic?
So we're very excited to have reached the point in the journey that we're at. Building these types of platforms, we kind of have a rule of thumb in the South African market, having lived the journey a number of times. It's almost a kind of a 5-year process, no matter how quickly you think it's going to be, no matter the best will in the world, from the day that you kind of conceptualize whatever you're building to actually, getting into kind of a live production environment generally takes, 4 to 5 years. So we're a long way down that journey. I can't say too much, but we're also, well down the road with a number of big tier 1 and tier 2 lenders, which is exciting. We've had lots of engagement with kind of conveyancer advisory panels, etc., and we intend to, keep doing that. Yeah, so our hope is I guess that, we can kind of prove the value of what a platform can bring, because we've seen it ourselves, albeit in a different market. But we just, we want to get it now into the market and, up and running, and then, let it speak for itself.
I always think it's very difficult to do justice to the kind of scope of the discussion that we might have in about half an hour. I hope we've done that justice through this podcast, Simon. But I really appreciate you joining. I mean, fascinating insight into the South African market and also into what you're looking to achieve as well. So thanks very much indeed for joining the podcast.
No problem. David, thank you.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Simon. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.